July 11, 1944. South of Caen. Hedgerows narrow the view to short lanes and small fields. Through a gap, an armored shape moves into sight, a high turret with an 8.8-centimeter barrel, a flat, heavy glacis, tracks pressing deep into packed earth. The distance is long. A flash arrives, then a delay, then the sound. The new rumor now has a target number and a silhouette. The months after D-Day were not only a contest of ground taken, but of expectations revised. Allied planners counted fuel, artillery tonnage, and replacement rates. German staff searched for a weapon that could reassert control over a battlefield now supplied at scale from British ports and American factories. The Panzerkampfwagen 6 Aus B, the Tiger II, was designed to restore the initiative not with numbers, but by dominating the line of sight. Its figures conveyed a simple message: frontal armor that common Allied guns could not pierce, and a gun that could defeat almost anything it could see. It was intended to be a decisive, war-altering technological statement. The specification sheet deserved attention. Combat weight about 69.8 metric tons. The 8.8-centimeter KWK-43L/71 gun-firing armor-piercing rounds at high muzzle velocity. Turret face around 180 millimeters thick on the Henschel turret. Hull front around 150 millimeters sloped at roughly 50 degrees. Optics by Zeiss. A mechanical core inherited from lighter tanks. A 700 horsepower Maybach, Shell 230 P30 engine, and a transmission final drive lineage, first used in vehicles roughly 25 tons lighter. This mismatch between the immense weight and the powertrain, designed for a much lighter vehicle, was a critical, if overlooked, detail. On a range, the Tiger II's strength stood out. On a campaign, the margins mattered. Reports of first contact in Normandy came quickly. British units around Caen encountered Tiger IIs of Schwerpanzerabteilung 503 in mid-July. Armor-piercing shot from Churchills and Shermans failed against the glacis and turret face at typical ranges. The German guns answered from beyond 1,500 meters. The psychological effect was immediate. American and British intelligence summaries repeated the core assessment. Frontal solutions were poor, flanking was essential. Superior optics and longer reach favored the defender. Soviet liaison reports from the Sandomier's bridgehead on the Vistula later matched these conclusions. The new heavy tank excelled in static defense or on prepared ground, with serious drawbacks in sustained movement. German crews, many with Eastern Front experience, accepted the Tiger II with high confidence. The platform promised what they had long practiced: use cover and angles, control range, place shots deliberately, withdraw before encirclement. They learned the controls, noted the steering effort, watched the temperature gauges, and filled logs with fuel consumption figures that expected generous supply. They knew how to create kill zones, how to use small slopes to hide the hull, and how to let an opponent make the first mistake. In these crews, the weapon found competent hands ready to exploit its awesome power. The road from assembly to battle exposed the rest. A small group of the earliest Tiger IIs, chassis 2800001 through 2800005, were allocated to Panzer Company Funklenk 316. On paper, the move to the front was straightforward. In practice, it became a case study. Within the first dozen kilometers, one transmission failed, stripped gear teeth and seized bearings. A second tank overheated on a modest grade. Coolant boiled, the engine seized. A third suffered final drive failure, sprocket and gear damage under torque. A fourth shed a track after a wheel bearing locked. The overlapping road wheel arrangement complicated field repair. Only one of the five reached a German position near Tilly intact. The others were immobilized by internal failure, not enemy fire. The unit re-equipped with assault guns. The Tiger IIs were later destroyed to prevent capture. This disastrous debut was a grim omen, a small-scale preview of the systemic flaws that would plague the vehicle throughout its operational life. The pattern repeated elsewhere at scale. In August 1944, Schwer Panzerabteilung 501 received 45 Tiger IIs and entrained for southeast Poland. After unloading near the Vistula, a 50-kilometer road movement reduced the battalion to 8 operational tanks. 37 suffered breakdowns, final drives, gearboxes, clutches, cooling. The surviving tanks entered combat around Ogledau and suffered losses to flanking hits. 2 intact vehicles were transported to the Kubinka proving ground. Soviet tests documented frequent overheating and ambient temperatures above 30 degrees Celsius, field breakdown intervals as short as 10 to 15 kilometers in heat, final drive failures under turning loads, and good gun optics performance. Soviet armor trials showed the KWK-43 could penetrate counterpart Tiger 2 turrets at close range. Welding quality on some plate joints was inferior to earlier German heavy types, a sign of declining industrial standards under Allied bombing. American exploitation mirrored this process. In late 1944, U.S. forces recovered Tiger II-332 and shipped it to Aberdeen Proving Ground. Ordnance engineers photographed, measured, and disassembled major assemblies. Their conclusions were clear. The gun and optics were excellent. Frontal armor demanded flanking or special ammunition. The powertrain was under-margined. A 700-horsepower engine from a 45-ton tank now asked to push nearly 70 tons. Gearbox and final drive designed for lower loads. Inadequate cooling under high-duty cycles. High fuel consumption and short practical range. Observers noted wear patterns on gears and bearings consistent with overload. An engineer from Detroit remarked that the design left little reserve for sustained operations. Our recurring symbol appears here, the engineer's torque wrench. A simple tool, but one that represents a culture of testing, measurement, and adherence to specified limits. A culture that saw the Tiger II's flaws not as bad luck, but as a predictable failure of design margins. The logistics picture enforced these judgments. Internal fuel capacity around 860 liters produced an ideal road range near 120 kilometers. Cross-country range could fall to 80 to 90 kilometers or less. A Sherman medium tank with roughly 660 liters could travel farther. Bridge limits imposed routes. Many military bridges were rated below the Tiger II's weight. Recovery assets capable of moving 70 tons were scarce. A single heavy recovery half-track could not tow a Tiger II. It often required 3, tethered together in a desperate fuel-guzzling train. Overlapping road wheels complicated track service in mud or winter. Inner wheels required removal of multiple outer wheels to reach a failed bearing. A thrown track on a Sherman might be corrected by a crew in an hour. On a Tiger II, it could take a day with specialized tools. A transmission replacement required cranes, alignment fixtures, and a rear area shop, a luxury rarely available on a collapsing front. Production numbers tell the rest. From January 1944 to March 1945, Germany built roughly 492 Tiger IIs. The U.S. produced over 49,000 M4 Shermans. Henschel's Castle plant absorbed repeated bombing, while skilled labor and specialty alloys grew scarce. Readiness ticked up late. On the 15th of March 1945, Tiger II's approximately 59% on paper, Pevels 4's 62%, Panther 48%. But without fuel, spares, and time, even better maintenance couldn't alter outcomes. In the Ardennes, Kampfgruppe Piper took Tiger IIs of SSPZA BT 501 into Belgium. Early conditions favored speed, thin American defenses, winter cover, hopes of captured fuel. The heavy tanks imposed their will where terrain allowed, but the advance outran fuel and repair capacity. Around La Glaise, Piper's men abandoned vehicles. 6 Tiger IIs sat where crews left them, some damaged, others intact but dry. Tank 213 remained in the village, later preserved, an image that endures because it captures the gap between promise and result. The lesson endures: industrial capacity and sustainment outweigh exquisite design. Allied doctrine adjusted quickly. Crews were warned to avoid frontal engagement, use air artillery when possible, and force movement to exploit flanks and mechanical fragility. Intelligence turned fear into tactical checklists, channeling the heavy tanks onto predictable routes. Reports from the Battle of the Bulge confirmed the strategy, noting more Tiger IIs abandoned from mechanical failure or fuel exhaustion than destroyed in combat. The threat was reframed: extremely dangerous in a prepared defense, but vulnerable on long movements and under sustained operational stress. German records acknowledge these difficulties. Field directives cautioned drivers to avoid abrupt maneuvers that stressed final drives. Incremental fixes like improved seals, stronger gears, and better driver training appeared in early 1945. But these gains were real, but far too late to change the war's outcome. 2 captured examples illustrate the type's divergent fates. Tiger II 213, abandoned at La Glaise, remains there today as a battlefield memorial. In contrast, Tiger II 332 was shipped to Aberdeen for analysis and later became a cutaway educational exhibit at Fort Benning. These 2 tanks, one in situ and one dissected, show how battlefield myth becomes technical fact under study. The broader comparison is unromantic. For the resources required for one Tiger II, Germany could have built multiple Panthers. Meanwhile, American factories built thousands of standardized tanks fed by a robust parts chain. A Sherman was not a better gun or armor package in a frontal duel, but most operational history is not frontal duels. It is marches, resupply, rough field repairs, and a rapid return to action. In that environment, reliability and maintainability become decisive forms of combat power. For German crews, the arc bent downward. Many were promised overmatch and found a machine that worked only in perfect conditions. Even veteran drivers admitted they could not trust a Tiger II to finish a long march. Every urgent redeployment hid mechanical risk. For Allied crews, the drift went the other way. In July 1944, King Tiger meant worst case. By December, it often meant breakdown on a predictable road, a target for artillery or air, or a queue to bypass. Fear didn't vanish. It hardened into method. One sound returns. A torque wrenches click in the motor pool. In the Allied system, that click meant more than maintenance. Parts on time, standardized procedures shared by crews and depots, a culture that treated repair as core. The click is not dramatic, it is regular. It is the sound of a tank that will move in the morning and of a formation present where the plan requires steady noise beating a weapon meant to impress once. The King Tiger remains prominent in popular memory. At its best, concealed, supplied, and crewed by veterans, it was formidable. The duller truth shaped the war. Most were defeated by the route to the fight, by fuel, by repair cycles, and by the inability of an overburdened drivetrain to carry 70 tons across real terrain. Across 1944 to 45, the balance of advantage belonged less to the most powerful machine and more to the army that could field enough good ones reliably, repair them quickly, and replace losses without delay. The epilogue is compact. A single abandoned heavy tank beside a hedgerow in France or a frozen lane in Belgium told both sides what the rest of the year would hold. Excellence in any one specification does not equal victory if the machine cannot reach the line. In a war decided by logistics and repetition, the decisive instruments were often simple. A wrench checked against a table, a spare gear pulled from a crate, a crew trained to fix what could be fixed. The rumor that began in Normandy narrowed, then faded. What replaced it was a quieter story, freedom backed by abundance, using routine to turn plans into action day after day until the fight ended.